You know that game, that Mushroom Wars game?
I do remember that game where you controlled a bunch of little mushroom soldiers and sent them to try to take over each other's forts or posts or whatever it might be. It's basically like a tower defense game in short, right?
Right, there's a couple of games like that. They're out there where what you do is you have points on a battlefield and you move units from those points to other points, and they create more units inside of them, and the whole point is to take over the whole map. This is that in VR, also adding in a strategic overmap that kind of reminds me of Star Wars Galaxies. I think that's what it was. Galaxy at War, or maybe more like Dune 2000, if anybody ever played Dune 2000, which I thought was a great game, but whatever. It's kind of like that with the overworld. And then when you go into a battle, instead of having a big RTS map, what you have is that Mushroom Wars style map.
I have seen the tower defense games done in VR before, but it was more like you versus an AI and you were kind of overseeing everything, and like you could transfer from being on the field back into your tower and manage everything from up top. But I have not seen that done in a PvP environment, so this is actually really interesting to think about.
This game is called Tactera. Hey guys, this is Moriarty.
And this is Brax.
This comes from the developer who did a game we recently looked at called Skylight, which was another turn-based VR strategy game.
I do remember looking at that one, and certainly it is easy to tell now that you say it that these games come from the same developer. They do look very similar in the pointing system and the way that everything works from the overhead, for sure.
I think that this one is way less complicated, but also much more fun. The Skylight game is really cool. It's fantastically cool. And if you haven't seen it, that was in Rapid Roundup number 11, which was roughly 3 weeks ago now. And it's an interesting turn-based strategy game, so clearly the guy's interested in strategy. We also looked at his game Darknet several months ago, and that was the first game he released, and that was also a strategy game. They're all really cool, and they're different, and they're interesting. I actually think that Darknet is probably one of the prettiest and neatest games that is out there on the VR, and unfortunately it just didn't get very much traction, but it's really, really cool. This one is also cool. It feels much more laid back.
Yeah, this game looks a little more bare bones in terms of the visual appeal. Like when you say Darknet was so beautiful, this one, it doesn't feel like it is that pretty, but it also, there's something about it that feels more chill, like it's not trying to do that. This seems like something that I would just play against with a friend, not necessarily to feel like everything's so beautiful or anything else, just to kind of have a strategy match against each other, sort of like, I guess, like old people used to play checkers for the same reason, right? I don't know. Now we have VR though.
So there you go, VR checkers. It's really very simple. I'm going to give you kind of a basic rundown of all of the stuff in the game, because there's not a lot, so I'll give you a very basic rundown of the entire game. You have your overmap, where you have units that are given to you based off of how many units you don't have. So if you have a piece of land, it will always have one unit on it, and anywhere from 0 to 2 empty spots. Every empty spot gives you credits towards more units, which you can then spend to bring new units to the battlefield. Once you have the units on the battlefield, if you and an enemy move a unit into the same spot, then they will battle. Think a little bit like Risk in terms of you always have to leave a unit on a territory that you've taken over.
Absolutely, that's pretty much how Risk works when I've played the actual, the tabletop board game, and I totally understand what you mean. Yeah, it makes sense.
You always had to leave one unit on a base after you had taken it over, after you'd taken over territory. So it's similar to that, and you move over trying to take over all of their stuff. And after every turn they get new units, just like in Risk, and then they get to move those units. And if you have both moved units into the same territory, then you have a battle. The battle itself is determined by the number of units you move into it. So if you move 3 units into a thing, then you get 3 bases to start with. If you move 1 in, you start with 1. And if they've moved 3 or 1, then they have however many to go up against you with. After that, you get to select the units that you're going to use, and there are a grand total of 12 different units. Each one does something slightly different. Some take much longer to build, some take no time at all to build, but they're incredibly weak, and you just kind of have to do whatever with that. Now, you have no clue what the other person is going to use, and I think that this is one of the major flaws, is that you have no idea what you're going to go up against. And so you end up sometimes having the exact wrong setup, and I feel like they should show you at least one, or they should give you a scale or something saying that your enemy is using this much air power or whatever, so that you can kind of, work against it, at least in the campaign mode. The multiplayer I can understand, but I feel like there needs to be something there where you always have the ability to have a rock, paper, scissors kind of setup. Because what happens now is with the 12 units, there are some units that are completely useless in certain cases. For example, I had one unit that was a airdrop unit. It dropped bombs. It was a bomber unit. And I had only sent one army in, so I selected a air unit, a land unit, and then I selected this bomber unit to be a heavy unit. And what happened was, it automatically gave my only base to that special heavy weapons unit, which means that I was completely screwed from the beginning. And I never would have chosen it if I'd been able to do that. I just had to sit there and watch as I lost the match. So there's a couple of problems with how they select units. The first being that you have no idea what you're going up against, and the second being that it will randomly, automatically decide what units are going to get bases. And I don't really like that. Now, I have a suspicion that it has to do with the way that you select the units and the order that you select the units as to what will go onto the ground first, but it wasn't made clear, so I'm not entirely sure.
All of that sounds, for one, really confusing, and number two, it does sound unfair for you to not have any idea of what you're going up against. Like, in that regard, it just seems like it would be a crapshoot at that point, and you wouldn't really be relying on skill or any sort of understanding of your units, more so than just, well, I hope that he's going to use this because I'm going to use this. And that just doesn't sound as fun to me because there's not as much thinking going on. Instead, it feels like luck and, well, I hope I get it right. And if I don't, I guess I'll just lose. And what makes that worse is, if you're doomed from the beginning, you have to sit through the entire match knowing, well, I'm screwed. And that would be a really boring few minutes to have to sit through, and a really disappointing one because
you've already lost.
Exactly.
Yeah, absolutely. So not only do you have the fact that you don't know what you're going up against, but additionally, you don't seem to have any way of deciding what units get used and in what order, which means that if you select a land unit, an air unit, and a special weapons unit, that special weapons unit might be the thing that you get with your one army on the ground, which means that instead of being able to do anything, you're just sitting there watching your special weapons do nothing, which means you're going to spend the entire match just waiting to die. And that's not a whole lot of fun.
So it seems like all of it does come down to, once you get outside of those problems with not knowing what exactly you're going up against, it's really a game about unit management from what I've seen. And for me, something you said earlier that is interesting, based upon how many of your units are on a certain base or area or how many aren't, that affects how much money you have to spend on resources or, upgrading or whatever it might be?
Correct.
Okay, so I also think, if I'm understanding this correctly, it does set it up in a way where if you are the one losing, you are basically going to have more money to spend than your opponent. Is that right?
No, you would think that that would be a smart way to do it, but what happens is your opponent, because they're winning, they get more units, and so therefore they're constantly pushing more and more units to the front, and they tidal wave you, and you lose. That comes to the next issue I have, which is exactly that. It is slightly unfair with how they do everything. Now, I should clarify, there's one thing I didn't bring up when I was explaining how the game works, and that is when you select a unit, you can't use those items again for 3 whole missions, which means that you will use them and they will die, and then you can't use them, and then you can't use them again, and now you can use them again, which means that you will often not be able to use the same units for quite a long time. Now, the problem with this comes down to when you are losing, you are able to get your best units, and you push out your best units, and you're like, okay, I'm going to win this one. But no, you lose it because you don't have the forces. So you are already down below and you're losing, right? Well, now you've got your best units and they're gone. They're just wiped out because you used them and you lost. And so then you're forced into other units and you're forced back again into other units. And there's definitely needs to be a little bit more of a handicap for the player, especially if they're losing.
That is the vibe that I'm getting, because I really do expect in these games, and I've encountered this problem before, I expect there to be, like you said, a little bit of a handicap for the losing party, because when I play the games where if you start losing, it's pretty much a foregone conclusion that you are going to lose, which I've seen in these RTS-style games before, I always lose interest really quickly, because if you play someone that has played even 4 or 5 matches before and you haven't, then it becomes really one-sided really quickly, and that's okay. You can do the learning scale and everything else. But I also think that in order to make these things balanced, in order for people to feel like it's entertaining throughout an entire match, from the beginning to the end, it really does need to have some way of balancing things when one team gets up on top of the other one. And I have seen games before do it in a way where, depending on who you are playing as, whether it be a faction, maybe it's a character or a hero that is a part of that faction, or a special character of any sort, they might have a special ability that will allow them to, say, freeze the other team in time for a second, or make one of their bases weaker for a turn or two, things like that, to try to bring balance to the game. Does this offer anything like that that could counteract the problem that you have with your units only being able to be selected once every 2 or 3 turns?
No, there is nothing, and you get nothing, and in fact it just gets harder and harder, and the winner gets more and more powerful, and they have an easier and easier time. So there's definitely nothing there where you, as the loser, have a Hail Mary, as it were.
That sounds like a problem that could be compounded by the things you mentioned earlier. So I feel like we've talked about quite a few negatives for this game, but I'm assuming from what you said at the beginning, you still do think it's a good game, right? Like, you did enjoy it. It isn't like these issues are so terrible that they hold it back from wanting to play it, or is it really that bad?
No, in fact, I think that the reason I'm willing to spend so much time talking about the bad stuff is that I hope that they will fix it, because it's already a good game. If this was just a bad game and it wasn't worth playing, it would have been a completely different conversation from the beginning. This is a good game, and it's a really fun, really good, interesting strategy title. I'm really a fan now of this developer, because I tell you what, this plus the Skylight game plus Darknet, they've produced a whole lot of really decent quality strategy games in VR. And it's really, really neat. And I'm very happy to be playing them. I just feel like this isn't the most fair if you start to lose. It's not the most, I don't know, whatever. You know?
Yeah, it's not the most whatever.
Right, it's hard to explain. So I kind of feel like when I'm looking at the overworld here, it feels very much like a game called Dice Wars, which is a Risk clone game that they came out with. It's a flash game. You can go play it for free, and it's super addicting, and it's a lot of fun because it's all about getting enough people into a certain spot and then using that to attack your enemies, and it's cool. It's a lot of fun, and there's still a chance, a risk that you will lose even with astronomically overpowered units, and it's very cool, and it's a lot of fun. And then you've also got a little bit of the Dune 2000 or Risk overlay, which is cool and gives you some strategic thinking because, hey, you know, do I want to go down and take out the middle, which is then at Risk, or do I want to try and take out the sides? Do I want to just rush straight through for his home base at the back and kind of screw him over and push him into different locations? that's all there, and I think that's neat, and it's a lot of fun to think about.
Well, I'm curious if this game were to somehow hypothetically blow up and get really popular and there would be lots and lots of people playing it and they would spend lots of time in it. Would there be a meta developed where the best players in the world would understand in what order most players use those units? I think there's 12 different units from what I can tell. And I wonder if something like that would be developed that would actually maybe help with the problem that you were stating earlier about I have no idea what my opponent is going to use, because you also said that some of the units seem to be worthless in a lot of ways. So I'm just curious if someone or a group of people out there were to just get really, really good at this game, would they be aware of each other's tendencies to the point that they're like, I know he's going to play one of these 3 units at the beginning of the match because that's how he always plays, or she's going to play one of those 3 or 4 units because that's the way that she does it. I wonder if there would be a meta like that developed for this game. I think that would be really interesting to see.
And you know what? That's entirely possible. The problem that I experienced here is, as with most of these games, there is nobody playing it. So I wasn't able to get into an actual multiplayer game. And it is a head-to-head multiplayer game, so I have a feeling that it is just choose 3 units, not a whole campaign. So you're just doing one battle on one field. You're not going up against them on multiple battles, doing a big campaign against them and trying to beat them for the long term.
I see. Yeah, it's always a problem to have to experience that when you see these online VR games with a lack of players, but unfortunately that's just the way the cookie crumbles sometimes. How much does this cost? Do you think that might have an impact on how many people are playing it? Is it reasonably priced right now?
It's the exact same price as every other game that he's done, which is $15, and I think that's a good price. Now that he's released this, you can get all 3 of his games for a grand total of $30, which means that if you are particularly interested in playing them, you can save $5 a piece and get them for $30. I think that's a great deal, because I really like all of the games that he's done. I think that this guy is doing the best strategy tactical games in VR. They're fantastically fun. They're super, super neat. You have the Darknet game, which is essentially being a NSA hacker and hacking the interwebs and moving things back and forth. Think a little bit like the hacking mini game from Deus Ex.
Right.
Only in VR, obviously, which is really cool. It's a really cool game, and I'm still sad that more people didn't pick that up. And then you have Skylight, which is the turn-based space battles game with full 360 degrees of movement and turns and doing cool stuff, and that's really neat, and it's a very, very cool game. I think it's an interesting game with capital ships and frigates and all that kind of stuff. And then we have this one, which is the tabletop Mushroom Wars meets Dune meets all of that strategy game together. So if you're a big fan, then you can save some money and you can pick up the bundle. If you're just looking to pick this one up, it's $15. I think that at $15, it's worth it, but I'd like to see more added to it to make it a little bit more fair and a little bit more transparent. I don't necessarily need to know exactly which units they use, but I feel like I should have a slider that shows me that they have absolutely no air power, so anti-air would be a wasted unit, and that stops me from wasting a unit on it. I think that if you made those kind of little changes, we'd have a really, really good game here instead of a pretty good game.
Agreed, and I would like to see some changes as well in the way that the match can go downhill for a player really quickly. Like, make it more balanced throughout, where if a player starts losing, they stand a better chance than they currently do, because that seems like another thing that might be a little unfair.
Pretty much. I just would like to see more. I'd like to make sure that every unit can at least do something, and I'd like to see that I'm never stuck with a superpower weapon that never charges up in an entire match, which has happened because they're just too slow. I get that they're the superpowers, but if they never are able to be used in an entire match, then it's a waste. I would also like to see that we don't have moments where I'm stuck with one of those superpowers and absolutely nothing else. So there should be a mandate that a land unit or a air unit or some sort of unit is the first base that's put down, not one of these superpowers. there's a lot of those kind of little things that I'd really like to see happen on top of everything else. And again, the only reason that I even bring any of this up is because I think it's a good game. Otherwise, I would have just thrown this into a rapid roundup and said, it's a bad game, don't play it.
Understandable. Yeah, I can tell that you find the game interesting because you do have so much to say about it. And I think it will be really awesome to hear the developer actually take all of this into account, which I'm sure he will when he sees the video. I still think for $15 it's a game that I would be interested in, so I will go ahead and recommend it. And also, if you are a fan of strategy games in VR, that bundle sounds like a really good deal as well. So I think both of those seem to be pretty fairly priced, and it's reasonable, and I would recommend it for sure.
So there you go, guys. That is Tactera. If you like it, like it. If you don't like it, don't like it. But if you did like it, why don't you go ahead and watch another video up in there in the corner right now. And as always,
We'll see you guys on the next one.